April 30th, 2026. James Broadnax stood at the center of a case that carried a sworn confession from another man, DNA evidence that raised doubt, and the voices of more than 60 religious leaders calling for mercy. Yet the state of Texas moved forward with his execution. No pause, no reconsideration, just a single decision from the Supreme Court that afternoon. Denied. For 17 years on death row, he had waited for someone to step in and say stop. He married just 2 weeks before this day, held on to faith, and prayed for the victims' families every day. By 6:47 that evening in Huntsville, Texas, it was over. His final words were steady, unshaken, unforgettable. And when you hear what he said, this story will stay with you. There is something about a final morning that feels heavier than time itself. April 30th did not arrive loudly for James Broadnax. It came the same way every other day had come for the last 17 years, through steel doors, controlled light, and a silence that never truly left. But this morning carried something different. It was not routine anymore. It was an ending disguised as another beginning, and everyone around him understood that, even if no one said it out loud. His legal team had not slept. They had spent the night assembling what they knew could be the final attempt to stop what had already been set into motion. At the center of that effort was a sworn confession from his cousin, Darius Cummings, a man who had stepped forward weeks earlier and stated under oath that he was the one responsible. Not James. That confession should have changed everything. It introduced doubt, raised questions, forced attention toward details that had not been fully examined before. But the courts did not move the way hope needed them to. They ruled that the claim did not meet the standard required to stop an execution. Still, the appeal had not yet been decided that morning. It sat before the highest court in the country, waiting to be answered. And inside that waiting, there was still a possibility, however small, that something could change. James Broadnax remained in his cell, holding onto that possibility. Those who interacted with him in those final hours described a man who had reached a level of calm that did not come easily. He was not frantic. He was not desperate. He carried himself with a quiet steadiness built over years of surviving a system designed to break people down. 17 years had taught him how to endure uncertainty without losing control. Outside the prison, voices continued to rise. Supporters, advocates, and leaders spoke out, asking for time, asking for reconsideration, asking for the system to pause. Inside, none of that noise could be heard. Inside, there was only waiting. Waiting for a decision that would determine whether the rest of the day would exist at all. And as the hours moved forward, that decision moved closer. The answer did not arrive with chaos or confusion. It arrived quietly, the way final decisions often do, without warning and without room for interpretation. By the afternoon, the United States Supreme Court had made its choice. The appeal was denied. Years of effort, layers of legal arguments, evidence, testimony, all reduced to a single word that ended everything. There were no more steps left. No higher authority to turn to. No additional time to ask for. The system had reached its conclusion, and it would not be reconsidered. The execution would move forward exactly as planned. Officials stood by the process, maintaining that the conviction had been properly reviewed, that the legal system had functioned as it was designed to function. But for those who had spent years inside the case, who had studied every detail, who believed that the confession and the questions around the evidence demanded deeper examination, that conclusion felt incomplete, felt unfinished. But belief no longer had the power to change anything. The timeline did not shift. The outcome did not bend. Inside the facility, the atmosphere changed the moment that decision became real. It was no longer a day filled with uncertainty. It was a day with a defined ending. When the news reached James Broadnax, it marked the moment where hope, in its last remaining form, disappeared. A man who had spent nearly 2 decades waiting for a different outcome was now faced with the certainty that it would not come. What stood out was not panic, not anger, not collapse. It was composure, a level of control that did not match the weight of what he had just been told. Those present would later describe it as something they did not expect to witness. Because the person who received that news did not reflect the image most people have of someone in that position. He did not break. He remained steady, grounded, present, the same man he had been in the hours before, and that quiet strength followed him as the day moved forward toward its final stage. As evening approached, the structure of the final hours began to unfold with a precision that left no room for change. Every step was planned, every moment accounted for, every detail part of a system that had carried out this process many times before. But repetition does not make something less human. It does not reduce the weight of what is happening. James Broadnax moved through each stage with a calm that continued to define his final day. In the years leading up to this moment, he had become someone different from the person who first entered that system. Those around him described a man of reflection, of faith, of guidance. Someone who chose to support others even while facing his own circumstances. He had built connections. He had created meaning in a place where meaning is difficult to hold on to. And just 2 weeks before this day, he had made a commitment that gave his life a new dimension. He got married, a beginning placed directly beside an ending, a promise made with a known limit. As the final hour drew closer, the reality of that contrast became impossible to ignore. His wife was there, within the boundaries allowed, carrying a goodbye that no one is prepared to give. The space between them defined by rules, but the emotion between them defined by something much deeper. When the time came, he was brought into the room where everything would conclude. Witnesses were present. The process continued, and he was given the opportunity to speak. What he said in that moment did not come from fear. It came from everything he had held onto for 17 years. His words carried belief, acceptance, and a message that did not change even at the very end. No anger, no chaos, just a calm, steady voice that remained consistent until his final breath. At 6:47 p.m., just minutes before 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening in Huntsville, Texas, James Broadnax was pronounced dead. He was 37 years old, becoming another name added to the long list of executions carried out by the state since capital punishment resumed in 1982. The process concluded exactly as scheduled. The file was closed, and before that same night had even fully settled, the system had already shifted its focus forward to the next case waiting in line. That is how it works. It moves. It does not stop. But for the people who lived through April 30th, 2026, nothing about that day ended so cleanly, and the question it left behind is not one that can be filed away or forgotten. There are lives permanently marked by what happened inside those walls. His wife, married for only 2 weeks, who stepped into a future that was taken from her almost as soon as it began. His attorneys, who spent years building a case they believed deserved to be heard fully, only to watch it reach a final answer they could not change. The dozens of religious leaders who raised their voices, asking for time, asking for reconsideration, and saw those requests denied. And the man who confessed, whose words entered the case too late to alter its outcome, now left to live with what that truth means. These are the people who carry the real weight of that day. James Broadnax spent 17 years inside a system that defined his existence. Yet those who knew him described a man who chose faith over anger, who guided others instead of breaking, who held on to love even when time was running out. Whether the system reached the right conclusion, whether every piece of truth was fully examined, whether justice was truly done, those are questions that will continue to divide opinions long after the official record has moved on. What cannot be debated is the reality of that final day. The waiting that began in the morning. The final decision that arrived in the afternoon. The irreversible moment that came in the evening. The words of a man who maintained his innocence until his last breath. And the silence that followed when everything was finished. Whether right or wrong, one question refuses to disappear. Was justice truly served?